We now want to look at the history of exchange rates. So I was looking at Canada. What have exchange rates been over the years? So let's start with the gold standard. The way the gold standard works is that the value of your currency was determined by the amount of gold your country had. Okay? So your exchange rate did not vary with changes in demand or supply of a currency. Your exchange rate was fixed. So then the amount a Canadian dollar was worth was tied to how much gold we have, and the amount the British pound was worth was tied to how much gold they have. And so then we can determine the exchange rate. So for example, if 1 Canadian dollar was worth 25 grains of gold, based on the amount of gold that we have stockpiled in Canada, and 1 British pound is worth 50 grains of gold, then you can see that both currencies are fixed to the amount of gold. We can then figure out how much the exchange rate is, because we can see that 1 British pound was worth 50 grains of gold. So then the question is, how many Canadian dollars do you need to get a British pound? Well, if a British pound is worth 50 grains of gold and a Canadian dollar is worth 25, then 2 Canadian dollars is worth 50 grains of gold and is equal to 1 British pound. So we could find our exchange rate between British pounds and Canadian dollars because the currencies were all fixed to the amount of gold. And the exchange rates didn't change. Well, this worked fine up until about World War II. And during World War II, countries on both sides of the war were buying materials. And when they bought materials, primarily from the US, they were paying for it with gold. So when Britain bought goods from the US, they gave the US gold. Before the US entered the war, they were selling goods to Germany, and Germany was paying in gold. So by the end of the war, the US had everybody's gold. So you could no longer use the gold standard for exchange rates because Canada and Britain were out of gold, and so were other countries. All of their gold was tied up in the US. So we couldn't use the gold standard anymore, which led us to the Bretton Woods Agreement. So there was an international conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, and this was to discuss what do we do about exchange rates. Well, what they decided to do is, since nobody had any gold anymore, they couldn't be on the gold standard. Since the US had all the gold, the US was going to peg their currency to gold, and then all the other countries would peg their currency to the US. Okay? So the US was able to convert gold on demand at 35 US dollars per ounce. Okay, so we're setting a value of the US dollar, and then we can fix our exchange rate between our country and the US. The other thing that this did is it created the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund is still in use today, and the International Monetary Fund provides loans to economies that are having a tough time. So when we've been looking this semester at Zimbabwe and Argentina. They all got loans from the International Monetary Fund to help bail them out when they had lots of debt and their economies were in recessions. So the International Monetary Fund exists to help struggling economies. The benefit of having this pegged exchange rate is that we got to keep the stability of the gold standard, but it allowed us to avoid the economic problem of the gold standard, which is we don't have any more gold stocked away. Now, when you think about the amount of gold, have you ever heard of Fort Knox? All right, so Fort Knox is a place in the US, and it was built to store all the world's gold that the US had accumulated. Okay. All right, so if we look at then, where's my graph? I'm just going to flip through for a second. here. So when you look at a Canadian to US exchange rate, you can see this period of time where we had a pegged exchange rate. So what we're going to do is, in the next video, is look at how pegged exchange rates work. But if we go back to the history, of course now it's all blurry. If we go back to the history of our exchange rates, we left the pegged exchange rate and we moved to what is called a managed float. And a managed float is where supply and demand determine the exchange rate. So in the next couple videos, we're going to look at how pegged exchange rates work and how the managed float exchange rates work.